So I want to just kind of follow with a couple of questions for you, Tim, because these were really impressive. So you can basically get carbon emissions, electric power consumption, and spatial requirements down by about 50% for each of those three things.
That's right.
And I couldn't quite hear you backstage, but did you mention the recent kind of metric that kind of benchmarked this?
Yeah, I didn't actually mention that on the presentation, but indeed, you know, it's one thing to come out with a system that you know, is very energy efficient. Obviously, we live in a world of intense commentary around sustainability, and there's obviously the propensity for greenwashing. It's just a fact of life. So it was very important for us that we could demonstrate to our users, and frankly to folks that we're in dialogue with who might use our technology, that this system, despite being generationally further ahead in terms of its consumption of energy, was as performant as it could be. So to your point, Clay, we worked with an industry association called ML Commons. ML Commons, for those that don't know, is, I'd kind of describe it like the Olympics of AI for geeks, basically. It's an open source forum. It was founded by NVIDIA and Google and Microsoft, and there's about 125 members now, and every 6 months there is a competition to run different AI models and see how fast your system runs them. And forever and a day, that's been the main metric as to how this Olympics are judged. Moving forward, and this submission that we just did, ML Commons said, look, AI has a sustainability problem. There's a green problem with AI. So why don't we start tracking power? How much power does it take to run these models? The end output is we've been the first in the world to submit not just the performance, but the power benchmarks and have that verified by the industry. And it's a very exciting moment for us.
That's great. You know, when we were visiting this data center, you made some comments that I thought were really interesting, and I thought maybe I might ask you to share with the group here. That the reason you came to Singapore was kind of the opposite of the, you know, the paradox of plenty. You know, we often feel, you know, hear the story about how countries that are blessed with lots of natural resources actually don't develop that much because they don't have to. Singapore is the opposite of that. And maybe you could say something about why that influenced your decision to come here.
As I mentioned, I'm from Australia originally, and Australia is a big country with a lot of energy. So that's sustainability and efficiency has never been high on the agenda. Singapore is a perfect environment to put to work the thesis that we need to do better. Singapore has power constraints, it has land constraints, it has a very strong drive at government policy level and within industry to do better on the sustainability front. So for us, moving our business to Singapore and setting up Singapore as our global hub was a good test, because we've been able to deliver into Singapore more AI capacity than has ever been available before in a private cloud like ours, thanks to this ability to use half the energy. So that's one of the ways that we've actually been able to showcase in a constrained environment like Singapore, this type of technology is needed.
So it's interesting to me because it's, you know, this observation that it's in precisely in energy and land and sort of resource constrained environments that you have to radically innovate. You can't just tweak the traditional air cooling system and get, you know, 3 or 4 or 5% increases a year. You've got to do something that's going to radically cut resource requirements. So it's kind of like, you know, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere, right?
Exactly, and you know, I absolutely love Singapore. I live here. It is very much that ethos. If you can prove it in Singapore, it's hot, it's constrained. They want to do better on sustainability. You can prove it to the world.
Seth, let me get you involved here. Seth, for those of you who don't know, is the former AI officer at IBM. He's written a wonderful book, which is available, I think, in the lobby if you get a chance to pick one up, and is really one of the most kind of far-reaching AI thinkers in the world. We're delighted to have him here. He is also the founder of a startup that is investing in sustainable AI technology. And Seth, maybe you could say a little bit about that and why you have chosen that path.
Yeah, so in addition to Qantm AI, which is a consulting company,
Right.
I also have a venture fund called One Infinity, which is part of the reason I came here, is to raise for that. And we invest in responsible, safe, and green AI. And investing in green AI is important, because there's a lot of greenwashing going on. You can get on quote-unquote green clouds. That's moving on green carbon credits, which is multiple counting of it's not really green. And so just like a lot of things aren't really AI. And so we really thought it was important, my partners and I, to look at how can we support true investments in things that are green, like really green. New hardware, new paradigms in how you support AI and workloads around AI. So some of them like what Tim's building, completely new ways of thinking about how you operate on silicon. So moving away from traditional semiconductor technologies to new silicon technologies that are 1,000 times faster than today's GPUs, or new math compression algorithms that are 50 times faster than traditional matrix multiplication, which is how language models run today. Or even things as simple as I'm going to have GPU as a service, and some percentage of those GPUs are going to be available as certified green clouds, where they run on wind or solar, or, oh my gosh, if you put it in Iceland, it can all be geothermal, and not only is it completely carbon neutral, in the wintertime it's carbon negative because they use it to heat the housing and the environments around them. And so there's lots of very simple things that startups are doing that are really, truly green. And so that's why we decided to start investing in platforms like this.
Interesting.
Oh, and by the way, you can make a lot of money on them.
Okay. One of the things that Tim and I discussed, which I hadn't kind of fully realized, is that part of the issue here is the people that operate data centers. They're not engineers, for the most part, right? They're real estate investment trusts and private equity funds that kind of think of these structures as office buildings or more or less an Amazon warehouse or something like that. But as Tim was pointing out, you really have to think about the engineering and think of them as factories in the way that an engineer would. How much, I mean, if we could switch to these kind of liquid immersion cooling type technologies and get away from the traditional air-conditioned model, what do you think, Seth, about that? Is that going to be a solution that will really move the needle in terms of power and space consumption?
You know, I think there's multiple ways that you can tackle this, right? One is, there's a lot of, traditional data centers are not just air-cooled, they're water-cooled. Water cooling creates problems of itself, right? If you go and use ChatGPT today or Claude, I don't know how many people know this, but for every 25 to 50 prompts, depending on how big they are, you use about a half a liter of water, just through evaporation.
That's insane.
Right?
That's
I mean,
absolutely
so,
crazy.
They're liquid cooled, more efficient than air, but you're still harming the environment. And so we absolutely need new paradigms of cooling. People say we're going to, consume 70% of the world's electricity. We've been running out of oil for 50 years. We're not going to run out of electricity. People like Tim are going to invent new technologies where, and we're going to hopefully fund some of them, that are going to get us to where we're going to continually find new ways to make sure that that doesn't happen. So it's going to be things through like new cooling. It's going to be new hardware paradigms. It's going to be new math paradigms. It's going to be moving away, and people talked about this earlier today. These massive, large models are not what the technology was built for. They're cool, they're fun, but that's not the solution. That's also going to help the power. It's really small models, it's more efficient technologies, and so we're not going to have this problem of these massively large models using all these powers, because that's not what the solution is.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So a couple of things I hear there. One is, well, so on this problem of kind of water consumption, you've sort of figured out how to recycle the water to make that more efficient.
Well, you don't use water, right? You use...
We use wastewater. So we use wastewater, and I'll describe a little bit, for a little geek out for a second here on how it comes together. But this concept of that you talked about, Clay, which is that, traditionally the data center, the end-to-end energy into knowledge,
Yeah.
whether it's cloud, whether you're using, whether you're doing a Google search or whether you're using, whatever, Apple Maps. There's all these things in between, which is this point, and you just said it too, Seth, there's this point behind it, the actual factory, that most folk don't see. We're using phones now and today, and you don't feel it and you don't touch it, but there's a real world impact. So this notion that there's actually been a silo, there's a data center who builds a building, there's a cooling engineer who builds a cooling system which involves chilled water, there's a computer manufacturer who builds a computer, there's a chip designer who designs a chip, and each one of those people says to the other one, you go figure out your part about this. You go figure that out. Someone will figure that out. When Jensen comes up with a chip from NVIDIA, someone else figures out the cooling. And it's been fine up until recently. Problem is that graph that I put on screen before, there's this insane amount of energy consumption now going into these chips. And a verticalized system like ours is the way that we get over that. To your point, Clay, and question about water, most data centers, whether they're using it for direct chip cooling or whether they're using it for air, they use chillers. And that's a real energy hog, especially in this part of the world where it's hot and humid. So when you use a chiller, you're really overcooking the amount of energy you need. Our system takes the building's effective wastewater, so it's called condenser water. So after the water has done its job in the rest of the data center, it goes out into an evaporative cooling tower and it gets recycled. We take it at its hottest point before it goes into that cooling tower. We bring it in to our hypercube, which is a self-contained system, and then it does its thing. So in that sense, technically we use water, but we use water that was already in the loop, and we don't use chillers. So that's the energy saving that we get.
What this kind of suggests is that there's been driving the chips, Moore's law, which we talk about all the time, is kind of well at work in making them faster and better and smaller, but that there hasn't been up until now a real Moore's law type dynamic in the way that we think about data centers. We just use we build the big ones out, keep on building them out, and that's what we need, is we need to start applying engineering and science to, condensing those.
I think to a certain extent. So data centers got smaller for a long time. For a long time, data centers got smaller and smaller, so much to the effect that, there were a lot of places where they were trying to figure out what to do with the space in data centers. But now that AI has really taken off, data centers, in some data centers, there's still a lot of room, but they're consuming more power because the chips are more power hungry. So in a lot of places, it's not a space issue, it's a power and heat issue. And so we shouldn't talk about a space, it's really a power and cooling or / heat issue.
And it's not that we can just put all the data centers in Iceland or Sweden or Denmark.
Well, I would challenge that actually.
Really?
Because do we really care about latency when we're having a conversation? And we need to really think about, when do we care about latency? When we're training models, we don't care about latency. When we're using models, when do we care about latency? If I'm having a conversation, so if my employees are having a conversation with a system, do I care if it takes a half a second versus a tenth of a second? Do I really care? Is that worth impacting my company's carbon emission? Right?
But that's a really interesting insight, because it shifts the focus away from the operator of the data center or the manufacturer of the chips, to the actual user of the data. And what you're suggesting, if I hear you correctly, is that we all need to figure out a way to be more thoughtful about the trade-offs involved in using.
It's part of the architectural decision, right? And getting back to what you said about my book, right? That's part of my conversation in my book. It's part of the architectural conversation you need to have when you're designing each use case. And it's part of the human conversation, right? When you talk about human-centered design, right? Panos was talking about the human AI. You got to think about the human. Who's the human's going to interact with it? How is the human going to, interact with it? What is the human decision? How important is that human decision? All of these things play into the architecture, which has implications on, we're talking about human-centered, when we're talking about green, it has implications to how you make that, how green how you would greenify that AI application.
So it's looking at the kind of demand side and the psychology of the user. I mean, I use ChatGPT all the time, and I've gotten really lazy about it. I mean, it's so good, it's so efficient that if I can't think of the right word, I'll use it as a thesaurus, when I've got an actual thesaurus that's probably on the bookcase behind me. And there's nothing about the way that is delivered to me, that service is delivered to me, that makes me stop and think, actually, you know what, for the amount of resources I'm gonna burn to just do this, I should actually take out a real book.
Or use Siri. Siri's on your phone.
Okay, yeah.
One interesting, unfortunate headwind to that, though, is the growing narrative around data gravity and data sovereignty, which because I'm of the same opinion. In fact, a system should be designed for its best use case. What we've designed, our AI factories, are not necessarily what you'd use for storage or what you use for general purpose CPUs. There's different horses for different courses.
Yeah.
But there is a very real and present, I mean, we see it with the CHIPS Act, but there's a lot more out there. There's very restrictive laws heading towards Parliament in India. There's a whole lot of countries that are very concerned about making sure that data doesn't leave the country.
Yeah.
And it might not always be the choice of the end user, unfortunately. So there's a policy piece to that as well.
Well, this sort of came up in our conversation with Minister Teo about data sovereignty. And if you're Singapore, for example, you can make the argument, well, why don't you just move your data across the border to Johor? It's cheaper. There's lots of space. But there's lots of data that you really, if you're Singapore, want to keep onshore. Your national health insurance data, the defense data, the military data, anything that's proprietary, commercial data, the big banks, these kind of companies. There are a lot of multinationals who will want to set up a data center here, but not have it across the border because they're not sure that it's as stable as Singapore is, which has a kind of better international brand.
Well, and if you're multinational, you can't control data sovereignty laws. There's data sovereignty laws in the Middle East, there's data sovereignty laws in Europe, there's data sovereignty laws in South America and in Africa. And so, yes, Singapore can control it for Singapore, but you can't control it for the rest of the world. And so even outside of individual countries, they're going to exist. And some of them are for good reasons, some of them are just because. So,
wow. Popular.
Yeah, but there are technologies now that you can actually, federated learning actually works now. We talked about it for a long time. It didn't really work. Now it actually works.
Seth, if we were to think of just kind of one or two things that we could really focus on and prioritize to fix this problem of energy consumption and carbon emission of data centers, what, in your view, would that be? I
think, especially when you're looking at generative AI, get back to the root of what the foundation models, which is the technology underneath generative AI, was actually built for. Look at using small task-specific models, so focused models. Those use a lot of energy, less energy because they're smaller. Focus on the use case, what problem you're trying to solve, and then determine what type of latency you can tolerate. And then I think, focus on, do you really need generative AI? What's the right tool for the job? And I think those are the things that you can do today before we develop new technologies.
Really interesting, been a very sophisticated, I feel like I've learned so much from this panel. Tim, I know you all are looking at bringing some of your manufacturing capabilities to Singapore fairly soon.
Yeah.
And we'll be rolling out, as you mentioned, to Thailand, India, and what was the other one?
In Australia.
In Australia.
And, further afield.
Great. So looks like it's a promising market for that kind of technology. We're out of time. I think we'll have to leave it there. But I want to thank our two panelists for a fascinating conversation about what really is a crucial topic for artificial intelligence. Gentlemen, thanks very much.
Thanks, Clay.
Thanks, Clay.